Hey everyone, welcome back to our Quants Worth Following series where we highlight quants in the industry who are worth following. So today we have one of my favorite guests here with me, Matthew Lyberg. I wanted to mention that Matt and I go back many, many years now. So currently, Matt Lyberg, he is the director of Quantitative Development at Manulife Investment Management. So I originally met Matt over 10 years ago, back when he was senior vice president at Acadian Asset Management. And since those 10 years, he's actually spent about a decade at Acadian, but then had many, many years in the experience after that as well. And so I actually wanted, Matt, if you could just say in your own words, we'd love to just learn more about your background because it is so unique.
Unique. That's a very kind word. Thank you, Christina. Yeah, it's wild because I mean, meeting a lot of quants in the industry, there's kind of this typical math or CS background. I was a Russian major, and so coming out of college, there were 300 million people who speak Russian better than I ever will. So it was kind of my first lesson in marginal demand. And I ended up being a documentary photographer. It's my first gig out of college, where just I was photographing the rebirth of Orthodox monasticism in Ukraine. So very different mindset from our day to day now. What was interesting though is it was actually the Russian language that helped me. I got very close with family here in Boston, refugees from the former Soviet Union, and there was this very great home away from home mentorship relationship and a lot of tough love as well. You know, just kind of a dear friend of mine, Alex Rosen, saying, what do you actually bring to the world? What's your trade? What's your skills? And you mentioned before, we talked about that kind of immigrant mindset of nothing is owed to you. What are you actually going to bring? And, you know, with that was the tough part, but there was also a lot of love where they connected me with Mark Ginsberg, who is a retired professor of mathematics here in Boston. And so after business school, I wanted to make a transition to finance, whatever that means. But I realized that I hadn't really taken any math classes since high school, pretty much. So it was literally starting from square one, like algebra, trigonometry. And Professor Ginsberg and we worked together like 4 years, 2 hours a week, very intense, where I would find a syllabus for a course and we'd go through it together, you know, in fairly accelerated fashion. But it was very much a different approach to mathematics than I had in school before that. And it was incredibly thrilling. And so I joined State Street Wealth Management Services, sort of State Street's what they were doing is they were taking their institutional custody model and applying it to the high net worth space. And it was a very exciting new division to be a part of. And so I got a lot of training in sort of fund accounting, back office operations. And that's kind of been my career, is that intersection of implementation where maybe there's a model going on and maybe there's some unusual effects. Having been through kind of the fund accounting background and knowing the math and kind of speaking some of the language of quants, I can kind of bridge the gap between what risks were realized in the portfolio and then what maybe we were intending to do, and apply that through currency, apply that through different assets and programs, and rinse and repeat. And that's kind of been my career. So really, really fortunate along the way to work at some great firms though.
Wow. I guess I'm curious about your advice to other people who also come from maybe less traditional backgrounds, whether they were liberal arts majors or, may not have had the usual background that you would expect within finance today. But curious on like what kind of advice you would have for people kind of earlier stage in their career as well that are trying to break into not just quant, but even just finance in general, whether that's skill sets or network or anything like that. Just would be curious to learn more from you.
So there's obviously these programs that are kind of part of a large pipeline, right? Where a lot of talent goes into finance, a lot of talent goes into quant, and there's all sort of, these kind of feeder programs. So try to get into one of those as early as you can. Certainly I wasn't on that path at all. And so for me, it was kind of just meeting with a lot of very kind people who helped me to set a direction. One in particular, Andy Kizik, at the time, he was an executive director at Goldman Sachs, and I was working a second job as a security guard. And he literally spent 2 hours on the phone, just kind of like helping me to understand dynamics within the industry, and finding incredibly kind people like that. What I realized coming in is like, what skills do I bring? And the answer was not much, but maybe project management. That was something I'd done during my MBA. And that got my foot in the door at WMS. And in WMS, I learned performance measurement. And then from performance measurement, I found a group at State Street that needed help with currency performance measurement. And so got into that group. And then, it was currency that kind of got me in the door at Acadian. So it's finding ways to be useful and maybe daisy chaining off of that. that's what worked for me. But again, individual results may vary.
I love that. Sounds like it's a step at a time, and each step kind of brings and opens new doors and new opportunities. And I think that's just wonderful. Just hearing your story is so inspiring, and also personally just following it over time. I mean, one thing is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you did the CMU CF program. Is that the correct name of the program?
Yeah, the MS in computational finance. I did do that.
Wonderful. Yeah, I remember that because they had the office visits. I remember they do like an annual trek where they go visit some quant trading offices. And when you came into my office, I was like, wait a second. Wait, I thought you were your partner at Acadian. And then, you did the MSCF program mid-career. So I'm guessing, I don't want to speculate about age or anything, but I'm
Yeah.
speculating or that you were not the typical demographic that the school typically attracts. So would maybe curious to learn more about your experience there as well.
Yeah, well, it was interesting because being at Acadian, I was there for a long time, and it was they're just fantastic. There were a lot of opportunities to contribute, and they also, paid for a second bachelor's in mathematics. So that was just great to be able to be useful professionally, but also have support for the continuing education. And at Acadian, a lot of my work was in performance attribution and analytics, and I felt like I could be doing more if I made the jump to portfolio management or research, but I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't feel like I really had the full toolkit. And they were also very candid that I didn't have the full toolkit, so that was helpful feedback there too. And so Carnegie Mellon kind of came about as taking a step back and sort of rebooting a little bit and getting the coding skills, getting kind of some of the higher level mathematical analysis skills. My goals were I wanted to be able to read a paper and develop a model, whatever that meant from both the mathematics and the technical perspective. And I feel like I accomplished that. What was funny about Carnegie Mellon, it took a few tries to get in, rejected a couple of times there. And then kind of the final go, I met with Professor Stephen Shreve, who's one of the founders of the program. And, we're talking about, okay, what does it look like for me to be able to get in? And he said, Matthew, it's not a question of you getting in, it's a question of you getting out. And I thought that was prescient advice where I had to take a couple of more graduate level mathematics courses, and it was an amazing couple of years with Lara and I, my wife, we moved our two kids out to Pittsburgh. It was quite an adventure. She was working actually with my current firm now, Manulife, and they were kind enough to let her work remote, and then the whole world went remote. And so it was quite an adventure. But yeah, it was a wild dynamic being over north of 40 and just being around all this incredibly talented folks who are maybe 1 or 2 years out of undergraduate on average. And then a couple of folks, the mid-career folks were maybe late 20s. So that was just incredible to see the energy and the way that just a lot of these students, I mean, dear God, we were doing stochastic calculus and they were kind of bored. And I just thought that was amazing that you could be bored, you know, having so much exposure to that.
I love that. It's also to me so inspiring to see it's never too late to go back to school, get a degree, study for the field that you want to do, pivot in your career and go in the direction that you want to. And I've always admired the fact that you're able to, focus on a goal, right? And actually take the steps to get there, whether that means moving your family all the way to Pittsburgh for a few years or other things as well. So really, really awesome to see you growing in here in your career. I guess would kind of be curious about your day-to-day job today, like what, as much as you're allowed to share about your divide between research or meetings or I don't know, trading, whatever it is that you do on your job.
Yeah, sure thing. So the organization I work for, it's more fundamentally focused, which is kind of a nice arbitrage trade if you're a quant, right? Because, when you think of fundamental investing, it's a question of depth where, I mean, I met with a portfolio manager a couple of weeks ago, and I learned about the pricing dynamics of Unilever's soap supply and the level of detail. It was like, and we could have had that conversation for any one of the 200 companies. And that was kind of my first exposure to that level of just intense focus and depth. Whereas quants were more about breadth, cross sectional. My former colleague told a story about how, Acadian accumulated a fairly large position in a company and that the management wanted to come out and visit because we were a major shareholder and we declined because we're quants, who cares? And as a quant, it's a cross-sectional comparison, and you're interested in exposures to factors rather than individual companies. The companies are the means to the end. And it's kind of thrilling to work in that intersection and that tension of, okay, what are some of the tools from quant land that we can bring to fundamental? And then maybe there's a lot of opportunity for refining some quantitative strategies with more fundamental views. And obviously, this is starting to converge with generative AI, right? Where we can think of doing depth at scale, which, is frightening. So how I spend a lot of my day now is kind of thinking about how do I help with that? Almost more like building pipelines and thinking about what infrastructure would be required. After Carnegie Mellon, I was really thrilled and lucky to work for a couple of years at different startups. And I mean, Christine, with your team, I've been following, Lou in particular, has just been absolute fountain of knowledge. I really appreciate his contributions. Just this idea of DevOps, right? And in a large enterprise, very often it's this release cycle of, something gets thrown over the wall to IT, or you implement a vendor solution. There's some like scheduled release program. Well, joining a startup, there really wasn't anyone to refactor research code. So my first day at YieldX, Chris Abbott, who's now at Boston Dynamics, really, really dear colleague, kind of had a heart to heart with me about how I needed to give up on my Jupyter notebooks.
Oh
And
no.
it was so sad, right? Because for especially lower frequency, quant research, that's kind of, you get graphs, it's all integrated, you can explore. He was like, no, man, that's not the move. We've got to think about, if you were to build a model that was useful, how do we make sure that's deployable? And that was my introduction to DevOps and this kind of new way of thinking where you're not building code just for you, you're building it so it's reusable, that it's secure, that, you build it, you run it, that kind of philosophy. And it's interesting to think about it, the firms like Robeco or Man Group, who are very open about their journey, Mike Chen, right?
Yeah.
They're talking about AI and quant for investment management, but a lot, Mike is very emphatic about how critical infrastructure is, and the incredible data team that they're lucky to have, Rubico, and thinking about, okay, we can do something on a desktop, but how do we make sure it meets all the compliance, regulatory dimensions that are quite important when you're in a heavy regulated industry like asset management? So that's a long answer, I guess, to how I spend my days.
Yeah.
Kind of, I still try to do some research projects, but a lot of it's more kind of helping with pipeline and platform questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I asked this question to a lot of people in the series, and they say pretty much the same thing. People underestimate how much time we spend right behind the scenes looking at whether that's infrastructure related or architectural decisions or data related decisions, things that you might not think of when you think of quant research from the get-go, or you're not really taught in the classroom as much. So that's such a great point.
Yeah, I have to be honest as well. I was a little taken aback. There was a Databento blog post a couple of weeks ago on how you shouldn't clean your data. And I nearly had a heart attack, but I ultimately agreed. I thought it was well founded that you should receive the data in the way that you're going to use it. And kind of that idea of bitemporal, where you have your as of, and then making sure you're time stamping your data so that how you get it is how you use it. That's obviously near and dear to my heart. So
Oh, it's amazing. Thanks. I know you mentioned AI briefly as well, and that's something that's been on a lot of people's minds. Would be curious to pick your brain on that too, like in terms of kind of where do you think this whole AI thing, is it a hype? Is it going to really happen and be implemented in finance? But yeah, curious on your thoughts on AI in finance.
yeah, I hesitate a little bit just because we have this great conference that Alex Slice put together in a couple of days, and that's the panel I'm moderating. So I don't want to take all the panelists' great ideas from our prep call. But I think the surprising thing for me is thinking about where it's going to get the most use. And for me, that's almost certainly in a lot of the operational and production roles where you have stable systems. You have, think of it as like parsing offering docs, right? Like looking through where you have a lot of text that you need to generate kind of some idea of structure and summary. What are the key points? Or in client reporting, or in a lot of these areas. I mean, at Katie, we used to try to formulate attribution commentary, right? And it is kind of formulaic, right? Like you look at the segments, you see what mattered that quarter, you drill down further and further. And, it seems like that could be very amenable. Where things are maybe less so for me. And this was a lot of my experience at Carnegie Mellon. I mean, I went to Carnegie Mellon to really focus on machine learning. That was my dream because, kind of getting away from some supervised learning. What does unsupervised learning look like? And how do we think about identifiability parameters? And like, you go to Carnegie Mellon, it's an amazing program. They have financial data science, they have machine learning, number of courses, and then they just like break your spirit when it comes to finance because they have you just do all of the, replicate papers or do a lot of these things where it doesn't really lend itself out of sample. But you can do brilliant in sample, and that's, obviously the bias variance trade-off and kind of thinking about how your model fits. But finance is ultimately an adaptive system, and the things that mattered in one period might not matter in the next. So thinking of other measures might be an interesting avenue. There's this really interesting paper from Mark Kritzman, Will Kinlaw, Megan Sosonis, and Dave Turkington on similarity measures. And I thought it was quite clever in just trying to, rather than classify regimes, let's try to find similar regimes and do our modeling from that point. So I've been kind of digging into that quite a bit.
I love that. Yeah. One of the quotes that I hear a lot is, at least from back when my hedge fund days, our LPs would say, like, I've never seen a bad back test. Right. And same thing. It's like, it works great in sample, but then when you actually put it to test in the real world, and then you realize humans are irrational beings. And there's a lot of things that in AI, it's harder for an AI to model versus a lot of things that AI is good at, like modeling out a game of chess or Go, that's a lot easier. But, when it comes to financial markets, it's a whole different beast out there. And a part of the reason it's actually also a data problem because sometimes the data in our industry, a lot more difficult to access, or it was captured differently. Even like funny examples, like CME data was captured differently from 2017 and before, versus 2017 now. So if you run a back test on it, it's almost like if you run two different back tests in order to really understand, what's going on before 2017. And so even issues like that kind of plague our industry in one way or another and provide various types of challenges to building out your models. So you bring up such great topics, and we'll try to get this video hopefully published before Thursday. So that way it'll be like right on time for the conference as well. And definitely looking forward to seeing you in person then as well. Maybe just a couple final questions to end really quickly. What are some of your favorite books or podcasts, videos, newsletters, etc., that you've enjoyed lately?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly biased. Data Quality Engineering and Financial Services by Brian Bazzelli. He was he was the chief data officer at Acadian, and it's very relevant to me because we're thinking a lot about these kind of questions, and I just find myself going back to that book time and time again, which is I know I'm quite biased on that, but I've really enjoyed Invest Like the Best, Patrick O'Shaughnessy's podcast. His idea of on ramps and how people can help you into a new world, that resonates a lot for me because in the Boston Quant community, it's a very kind community with like Quaff a few and just folks who are Dan DiBartolomeo at Northfield who just is willing to mentor and kind of talk through problems. And I feel like Patrick's podcast really captures a lot of that as it applies to investment management. So those are maybe two that come to mind.
Yeah. One thing I love, by the way, about this community is that there are people out there who are willing to share and who are willing to help out and contribute and have great content. And they're not there to make a billion dollars off of people, subscriptions or anything like that. It's just genuinely people posting interesting content and trying to help make this industry a little bit more, I guess, debunk all the myths and make it more accessible to people from the outside. So really, really cool that you gave a shout out to some of those awesome folks out there. And then maybe just a final question about career advice in general. Just curious if you have any advice you would give to people who are looking to enter the quant industry today.
Yeah, don't do what I did. I would like don't. I think make sure you enjoy it because it's an ongoing process. I mean, honestly, I kind of hope I go to Carnegie Mellon and be like, boom, stamped, you're smart and ready to get after it. But there's so much that's moving so fast. I feel like that was just like the start of it. Whether it's CFA, whether it's grad school, it's always the start of it because things are moving so fast. And I'm finding like my learning is moving more from books to conversations because that just seems to be the only way to keep up with things. And so finding that community, finding those conversations, I think is maybe the way I would try to do it now if I had to start over is focus on those a little more.
Yeah, same for me during my quant fund days. One of the big things that surprised me was how much time we spend just whiteboarding, meeting in a
Yeah,
room and just having those conversations and drawing the diagrams, even to our office. So you've seen like all the writing on the literally on the walls, right? Like
like beautiful mind. It was
that's kind of the stuff that, I'm like, oh, that's actually why, by the way, for us being remote is a little bit harder, is because we don't get that time to sit together and to have those real like whiteboarding sessions. And you're right. I think a lot of the knowledge sharing these days comes from that. And a lot of the insights we get is from those kinds of meetings rather than by reading like a textbook or a paper, which are still very helpful, by the way. But just, I think they all supplement each other and each have a space in the day to day life of a quant.
absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the show and looking forward to your talk on Thursday, April 4th at the Fordham Conference.
Christina, thank you so much. It was really great to see you, and I'll see you in a couple of days.
Yep. Okay. Take care. Bye.